Kara-chan walked through the corridors of Nexus Academy with her head down, books clutched tightly against her chest. The bruise on her left cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but it still drew stares and whispers from her classmates. She quickened her pace, hoping to reach her next class without incident. "Look, there goes Fighter Girl again," Marcus Vale called out, his voice carrying down the hallway. The tall Zen3 student's scaled skin shimmered with amusement as his friends laughed. "What happened this time, Kira? Walk into another door?" Kara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. At 17, she had learned that fighting back only made things worse. The other students at this elite interstellar academy came from powerful families across the galaxy. She was here on scholarship, representing humanity among dozens of alien species, and she couldn't afford to cause trouble. The Nexus Academy was humanity's first successful integration into galactic education. Built on the neutral world of Axiom Prime, it housed the children of diplomats, trade moguls, and military leaders from across the known galaxy. Humans had only been part of the Galactic Council for 23 years, making them newcomers among species that had been spacefaring for millennia. "I heard she was caught fighting again last weekend," whispered Lydia Brass, a Vorthan girl whose family controlled half the mining operations in the Outer Rim. Her three eyes blinked in sequence as she spoke. "My father says humans are naturally violent. It's in their primitive DNA." Kira's knuckles went white around her books. She wanted to tell them the truth, wanted to explain that the fresh cuts on her hands weren't from starting fights but from stopping them. But who would believe her? Who would understand that she spent her weekends in the lower districts of Axiom Prime, where refugees and outcasts gathered in forgotten corners of the city? Professor Nalitha's Universal History class was already in session when Kira slipped inside. The elderly Thylorian barely glanced up from his lecture about the siege of Kepler's Gate. His forearms moved gracefully as he manipulated the holographic display, showing ancient star maps and battle formations. "Ah, Miss Chen. How thoughtful of you to join us," Professor Nalith said without looking in her direction. "Perhaps you can tell the class about humanity's role in the Kepler conflict?" Kira felt heat rise in her cheeks as every eye in the classroom turned toward her. "Humans weren't involved in that conflict, sir. It happened 300 years before we achieved faster-than-light travel." A ripple of snickers ran through the class. Zara Nightfall, a Umbran whose shadow-like form flickered at the edges, materialized fully just to smirk. "How convenient for the humans. They always seem to miss the important events." "Indeed," Professor Nalith continued, his tone neutral but his words cutting. "Humanity has a rather limited perspective on galactic history, having spent most of it confined to their single world, fighting amongst themselves." Kira bit her tongue. She knew the professor wasn't entirely wrong. Human history was filled with wars, conflicts, and divisions. But it was also filled with innovation, resilience, and an incredible capacity for growth. In just over 2 decades since first contact, humans had established colonies on 17 worlds and contributed breakthrough technologies to the galactic community. The lesson continued, but Kara's mind wandered to the previous weekend. She had been walking through Sector 7, one of the rougher areas near the academy, when she heard shouting from an alley. 3 Krillian thugs had cornered an elderly Fen shopkeeper, demanding protection money. The Fen, barely 4 feet tall with large, frightened eyes, trembled as they threatened to destroy his small electronics repair shop. Kira had stepped in without thinking. The Krillians were each twice her size, their exoskeletons gleaming under the dim alley lights. But she had learned to fight not from aggression, but from necessity. Growing up in the Detroit Reclamation Zone, she had defended younger kids from gangs, protected her mother from desperate addicts, and survived in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. The fight had been quick but brutal. Kira's training in mixed martial arts, combined with humanity's higher bone density and muscle efficiency, gave her advantages the aliens didn't expect. But the Krillian's natural armor had torn her knuckles bloody, and one had managed to land a solid blow to her face before she subdued them. The elderly Fen had tried to thank her, pressing a small device into her hands before hurrying away. She had looked at it later in her dorm room, a crude but functional medical scanner, probably worth more than the thugs had been demanding. But she couldn't explain any of this to her classmates. They saw the injuries and assumed the worst about humans and their supposed violent nature. Miss Chen. Professor Nalatha's voice snapped her back to the present. Since you seem so engaged with the lesson, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the Thylaurian philosophy of contained aggression? Kira straightened in her seat. She had actually read about this. The Thylaurians believed that intelligent species should channel their aggressive impulses into constructive pursuits like exploration, scientific research, and artistic expression, rather than warfare. Correct. And, do you believe humans are capable of such evolution? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the classroom, alien faces watched her with mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. Marcus Vale's scaled features showed obvious doubt, while Lydia Brass's 3 eyes seemed to glitter with amusement. I think, Kira said carefully, that every species is capable of growth. Humans have made mistakes in their past, but they've also shown incredible capacity for change. In just 23 years since joining the galactic community, they've contributed medical breakthroughs, agricultural innovations, and diplomatic solutions that have benefited everyone. Pretty words, Zara Nightfall whispered, her form flickering slightly. But we all know what humans are really good at. Professor Nalath raised one of his 4 hands for silence. Miss Nightfall, please elaborate on your observation. Zara's shadowy form solidified, and her dark eyes fixed on Kira. Humans excel at violence. They're the only species in the galaxy that evolved while constantly at war with themselves. Even now, look at our human classmate. Always covered in fresh bruises, always looking like she's been fighting. It's in their nature. The accusation hit Kira like a physical blow. She felt her face burning, saw the knowing nods and murmurs of agreement from her classmates. In their minds, her injuries were proof of humanity's violent tendencies. They couldn't imagine that she might be using her strength to protect others rather than harm them. That's not, she began, but Professor Nalath cut her off. This is an interesting perspective that connects to our lesson. The Thylaurians faced similar challenges when they first encountered more aggressive species. They found that understanding the root causes of violence was key to transformation. The discussion continued around her, but Kira felt increasingly isolated. Her classmates debated humanity's place in galactic society as if she weren't sitting right there. They spoke about humans as specimens to be studied, potential threats to be managed, or primitive beings to be pitted. When the class finally ended, Kira gathered her books quickly and headed for the door. But Marcus Vale blocked her path, his impressive height casting a shadow over her. You know, Chen, maybe you should consider anger management classes. The Academy offers counseling for species struggling with violent impulses. His friends laughed, and Kira felt her hands clench into fists. For a moment, she wanted nothing more than to show him exactly what human violence could accomplish. But, instead, she took a deep breath and stepped around him. Thanks for the suggestion, she said quietly. I'll consider it. As she walked away, she heard Zara Nightfall's voice behind her, see? Even now, you can see the aggression in her posture. Humans really haven't evolved past their primitive instincts. Kira made it to her dorm room before the tears came. She sat on her narrow bed, staring out at the sprawling city of Axiom Prime beyond her window. Somewhere out there, in the lower districts, people needed help. Refugees from war-torn worlds, families displaced by corporate exploitation, individuals forgotten by the galactic community's endless bureaucracy. She had found her purpose in protecting them, using her human strength and resilience to stand between the vulnerable and those who would prey upon them. But her classmates saw only the evidence of fights, the bruises and cuts that marked her as violent and dangerous. Her communication device chimed softly. A message from her mother back on Earth, hope you're settling in well at the Academy, sweetheart. Remember, you're representing all of humanity out there. Make us proud. Kira laughed bitterly. If only her mother knew how she was really representing humanity. Not through academic excellence or diplomatic grace, but through bloody knuckles and back alleys, standing guard over those who couldn't protect themselves. She opened her study materials for the next day's classes, but found it hard to concentrate. Tomorrow would bring more suspicious looks, more whispered comments about human violence, more isolation from classmates who saw her species as a collection of barely civilized barbarians. But tomorrow would also bring another weekend, another chance to walk through the lower districts, another opportunity to use her strength for something that mattered. Even if no one at the academy would ever understand, even if she had to bear the weight of their assumptions about her species, she would continue to fight for those who needed protection. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to prove that humans could be better than their violent reputation, she was forced to embrace that very violence in service of justice. It was a contradiction that kept her awake at night, wondering if there was any way to bridge the gap between perception and reality. Outside her window, the lights of Axiom Prime glittered like stars, and, somewhere among them, people slept safely because of what she had done in the shadows. It would have to be enough, even if it meant carrying the burden of misunderstanding alone. The emergency alarm shrieked through Nexus Academy at 3:47 a.m., jolting students from their sleep. Red lights flashed in the corridors as the academy's security protocols activated. Kara Chen bolted upright in her narrow dormitory bed, instantly alert. Growing up in the Detroit reclamation zone had taught her to recognize the difference between drills and genuine emergencies. This was real. All students remain in your dormitories, came the announcement over the intercom system. This is not a drill. Security teams are responding to an incident. Do not leave your rooms under any circumstances. Through her window, Kira could see security vehicles racing toward the lower districts of Axiom Prime. Their lights painted the darkness in urgent blues and reds. Something major was happening down there, in the sectors where she spent her weekends helping those who had nowhere else to turn. Her roommate, a nervous Quillan named Seska whose species resembled oversized rabbits, cowered under her covers. "What do you think is happening?" she whispered, her large ears twitching with anxiety. "I don't know," Kira lied. But she had a sinking feeling that whatever was occurring in the lower districts might be connected to her recent activities. The protection money schemes she had been disrupting, the criminal organizations she had been interfering with, they wouldn't tolerate her interference forever. Hours passed before the all-clear signal sounded. By then, the academy was buzzing with rumors and speculation. During breakfast in the Great Hall, news feeds finally revealed the truth: a coordinated attack on 3 refugee camps in Sector 7. Buildings had been bombed, families terrorized, and dozens of people injured or killed. Kara's hands shook as she watched the footage on the communal screens. These were places she knew, people she had tried to protect. The elderly Fen shopkeeper she had helped the previous weekend appeared briefly in the background of one shot, his small electronics shop now a smoking ruin. "Terrible business," Professor Nalith commented as he passed her table. The local authorities suspect it was retaliation against some vigilante who had been interfering with organized crime operations. Whoever this person is, their misguided heroics have made things much worse for the very people they claim to help. The words hit Kira like physical blows. Around the dining hall, she could hear similar conversations. Her classmates discussed the attacks with the detached interest of academics analyzing a case study. They debated security measures and political implications while the bodies of innocent people lay cooling in hospital morgues. "This is exactly what I mean about primitive species," Lydia Brass was saying to a group of friends at a nearby table. "Someone from a less evolved culture thinks they can solve complex social problems through violence. Now look at the result." Kira pushed her food around her plate, unable to eat. The guilt was crushing. She had tried to help, tried to protect the vulnerable, but her actions had apparently triggered this massive retaliation. Every death, every injury, every family torn apart by terror, it was her fault. In advanced xenobiology class, Professor Yilmaz, a Kepleran with chitinous features and multifaceted eyes, announced a change to the day's lesson plan. "Given recent events, I think it would be valuable to discuss the psychological patterns that lead to vigilante behavior among different species." Kira sank lower in her seat as the professor pulled up holographic displays showing brain scans and behavioral analyses. Certain species, particularly those that evolved in hostile environments or through constant territorial conflicts, show pronounced tendencies toward what psychologists call heroic violence. They genuinely believe that applying force can solve problems, even when more sophisticated approaches would be more effective. Marcus Vale raised his scaled hand. "Professor, are you referring to humans specifically?" "I'm referring to any species that hasn't fully developed beyond their primitive survival instincts." However, humans do provide an excellent case study. Their recent integration into galactic society has been marked by numerous incidents where individual humans have attempted to fix situations through force rather than proper channels. The professor's multifaceted eyes seem to focus directly on Kira. The tragic events in Sector 7 appear to be the result of exactly this type of thinking. Someone decided they could single-handedly combat organized crime, and their reckless actions have now cost innocent lives. Kira felt like she was suffocating. Every word was true, every accusation deserved. She had let her human instincts override her intelligence, and people had died because of it. Miss Chen, Professor Yilmaz continued, as our human representative, perhaps you could offer insight into this psychological pattern? Do you believe humans are capable of moving beyond such primitive responses to complex problems? The entire class turned to stare at her. Kira saw curiosity in some faces, mockery in others, and what might have been pity in a few. But mostly she saw the confirmation of everything they had always believed about her species: humans were violent, impulsive, and dangerous. I think, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, that sometimes good intentions aren't enough. Sometimes trying to help just makes everything worse. An interesting admission, the professor noted. Self-awareness is the first step toward evolution. Perhaps there's hope for humanity after all, if individuals like Miss Chen can recognize their species' limitations. After class, Kira fled to the Academy's observation deck, a quiet space overlooking the city. She needed to think, to process what had happened and what it meant. But she wasn't alone for long. Heavy thoughts, fighter girl? Zara Nightfall materialized from the shadows near the viewing wall. Her form was more solid than usual, suggesting strong emotions. Don't call me that, Kira said without looking up. Why not? It's what you are, isn't it? Zara moved closer, her dark features unreadable. My family has connections in the lower districts. We know about your weekend activities. Kira's blood went cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. The timing is too obvious. Fighter girl disappears every weekend, comes back with fresh injuries. Meanwhile, someone matching your description has been playing superhero in Sector 7. Zara's voice carried an odd tone, not the usual mockery but something more complex. And now look what your heroics have accomplished. The accusation hung between them like a blade. Kira waited for Zara to call security, to expose her to the Academy administration. Instead, the Umbran girl sat down beside her on the observation bench. You know what the really pathetic part is? Zara continued. You actually thought you could make a difference. You saw suffering and injustice, and your primitive human brain told you to punch it until it went away. Tears ran down Kira's cheeks, but she didn't try to hide them. Those people needed help. The authorities weren't doing anything. The gangs were getting stronger, the refugees were being exploited, so you decided to become their savior? Zara's laugh was bitter. And now they're dead. That old Fen shopkeeper you were so proud of helping? His body was found in the rubble of his shop. Apparently the crime bosses wanted to make an example of anyone the vigilante had contacted. The words shattered something inside Kira. She doubled over, gasping for air as the full weight of her failure crashed down on her. Mr. Kellex had been so grateful for her help, so relieved to have someone care about his safety. And now he was dead because she had dared to interfere. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Zara was quiet for a long moment, her shadowy form flickering with unreadable emotions. Because I want you to understand something. Your species isn't just violent, you're dangerously naive. You think the galaxy works like one of your human stories, where the hero fights the bad guys and everyone lives happily ever after. She stood, looking down at Kira with something that might have been pity. The real galaxy is complicated. Power structures exist for reasons. Criminal organizations fill economic and social niches that legitimate institutions can't or won't address. When you disrupt those systems without understanding them, innocent people pay the price. Then, what was I supposed to do? Kira looked up, desperation in her voice. Just watch them suffer? Pretend I didn't see the injustice? You were supposed to be smart enough to realize that one violent human can't fix problems that entire civilizations struggle with. Zara's form began to fade back into the shadows. But humans never were known for their wisdom, were they? Just their enthusiasm for making things worse. Alone again, Kara stared out at the city where people had died because of her actions. The observation deck's transparent wall showed her own reflection ghost-like against the urban landscape below. She looked exactly like what she was, a foolish child who had played with forces beyond her understanding. Her communication device buzzed with a message from her academic advisor. Miss Chen, please report to my office at your earliest convenience. We need to discuss your future at the academy. The message was politely worded, but Kara could read between the lines. Someone had connected her to the vigilante activities. Her time at Nexus Academy was over, her chance to represent humanity on the galactic stage destroyed by her own actions. As she made her way through the corridors toward the administrative offices, she passed groups of students discussing the attacks. Their conversations followed her like accusations. The whole situation proves that integrating primitive species too quickly is dangerous, she heard Marcus Vale telling his friends. Humans simply aren't ready for galactic civilization. My father says the Council is considering new restrictions on human activities throughout the galaxy, added Lydia Brass. This incident will set back human-alien relations by decades. Each word was a knife in her heart. Kara had wanted to prove that humans could be more than their violent reputation suggested. Instead, she had provided perfect evidence for every stereotype and prejudice her species faced. She had failed not just herself, but every human who would come after her. The administrative office was sterile and cold, designed to intimidate. Dean Zareth, an imposing draconian with scales that shifted color based on mood, waited behind an ornate desk. His scales were currently showing deep red patterns, anger mixed with disappointment. Miss Chun, he began without preamble, I'm sure you know why you're here. Kara sat in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap. Yes, sir. The events in Sector 7 have been traced to vigilante activities that match your weekend disappearances. Security footage from several locations shows someone of your approximate height and build engaging in combat with local criminal elements. The Dean's scales darkened further as he continued. Do you understand the magnitude of what has happened? Innocent people are dead. The Academy's relationship with local authorities has been compromised. And humanity's reputation within the galactic community has suffered severe damage. I understand, she whispered. Do you? Do you truly comprehend that your primitive desire to play hero has undone years of careful diplomatic work? Humans were accepted into this academy as an experiment in integration. You were chosen to represent your species' potential for growth and civilization. Dean Zareth stood, his imposing form casting a long shadow across the desk. Instead, you have proven every critic right. You have demonstrated that humans are indeed too violent, too impulsive, too fundamentally uncivilized to take their place among advanced galactic cultures. The words destroyed the last of Kara's composure. She broke down completely, sobbing as years of pressure and isolation finally overwhelmed her defenses. She had tried so hard to be worthy of her place at the academy, to prove that humans belonged among the stars. Instead, she had become the living proof of her species' limitations. Please, she managed through her tears, I was trying to help them. I saw people suffering and I thought you thought like a human, Dean Zareth interrupted. With violence, with arrogance, with complete disregard for consequences. That is exactly the problem. The Dean's scales shifted to a colder blue as he delivered his final judgment. Your enrollment at Nexus Academy is terminated, effective immediately. You will return to Earth on the next transport. And, Miss Chen, this incident will be part of your permanent record. Any future attempts to participate in galactic institutions will be viewed in light of what happened here. As Kara walked back to her dormitory to pack her belongings, she felt the weight of not just her own failure, but her species' future pressing down on her. The other students watched her with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity, confirming what they had always believed about humans. In her room, she gathered her few possessions while Seska watched nervously from her bed. The Quillen girl finally spoke as Kara folded her clothes. "I'm sorry you're leaving," she said quietly. "I know we didn't talk much, but you were always kind to me. When the others made fun of my accent or my species' reputation for cowardice, you never joined in." It was a small kindness, but it broke Kara's heart all over again. She had found fragments of friendship here, moments of genuine connection across species lines. But her actions had poisoned even those relationships, confirming that humans and aliens were too different to truly understand each other. As the transport ship prepared for departure, Kira took one last look at Nexus Academy through the viewport. The impressive structure represented everything humanity aspired to achieve among the stars: knowledge, cooperation, and acceptance into a community larger than themselves. She had been given the chance to be part of that dream, and she had destroyed it with her own hands. 3 months after her expulsion from Nexus Academy, Kira Chen was working double shifts at a recycling plant in the Detroit Reclamation Zone when the emergency broadcast cut through every communication channel in human space. "This is Admiral Sarah Martinez of the Galactic Defense Fleet. We are issuing an immediate distress call to all member species. The Nexus system is under attack by an unknown hostile force. Multiple colonies are under siege, and civilian populations are in immediate danger. All available ships and personnel are requested to provide assistance." Kira stopped mid-motion, a piece of scrap metal still in her hands. Around her, other workers had gathered around the communal screen, watching in horror as images streamed in from the Nexus system. The feeds showed massive ships of unfamiliar design attacking peaceful worlds, their weapons reducing cities to burning ruins. "Reports indicate that Axiom Prime itself is under assault," the Admiral continued. "The planet's defense grid has been compromised, and ground forces are advancing on population centers. Nexus Academy has activated emergency protocols, but the facility is not equipped for military resistance." The Academy. Kira's chest tightened as she thought of her former classmates, still trapped in the ivory towers of their academic paradise while real violence descended upon them. Whatever her failures, whatever mistakes she had made, those students didn't deserve to face this kind of terror. The hostile force appears to be the Hegemony Coalition, a militant alliance that has been expanding aggressively through uncharted space. Admiral Martinez's voice crackled with static as the transmission quality degraded. "Their technology is advanced, and their tactics suggest extensive military preparation. They have demanded the complete surrender of all Galactic Council worlds within 72 hours. The broadcast cut to footage from Axiom Prime's surface. Kira recognized the lower districts where she had once tried to protect refugees and outcasts. Now those same streets burned under alien bombardment, their inhabitants fleeing in panic. The irony was bitter. The people she had failed to save from crime bosses were now facing extinction from an enemy beyond imagination. "All Galactic Council species are contributing ships and troops to the defense effort," the Admiral continued. "However, initial engagements suggest that conventional military tactics are insufficient against this threat. The enemy appears to have extensive intelligence on our standard operational procedures." Her supervisor, a gruff man named Rodriguez who had worked the reclamation zone since the climate wars, noticed her distraction. "Shen, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "That school I attended," she said quietly, still staring at the screen. "My friends are on Axiom Prime." Rodriguez followed her gaze to the images of destruction. "Well, there's nothing we can do about it from here. The big shots with their fancy ships will handle it, or they won't. Either way, we've got quotas to meet." But Kira couldn't focus on quotas while watching the galaxy burn. Over the following days, she monitored every news feed, desperate for information about the Academy and its students. The reports grew increasingly grim. The Hegemony Coalition's forces were unlike anything the Galactic Council had encountered before. They adapted rapidly to defensive strategies, seemed immune to electronic warfare, and fought with a coordination that suggested hive mind tactics. The enemy had landed ground forces on Axiom Prime within hours of their initial attack. The city's defenders, trained for peacekeeping rather than warfare, crumbled before the assault. Nexus Academy, with its high-profile student body from across the galaxy, had become a priority target. The complex was surrounded, its students and faculty trapped inside with dwindling supplies and no hope of evacuation. "The siege of Nexus Academy continues into its 5th day," reported the news anchor, a holographic human woman with carefully neutral features. Galactic Defense Force attempts to break through the blockade have been unsuccessful. Military analysts suggest that the facility's defensive systems were never designed to withstand this level of assault. Kara watched interviews with families across the galaxy, parents desperate for news of their children trapped in the academy. She recognized some of the names: Marcus Vale's father, a prominent Zen-3 ambassador, Lydia Brass's mother, the mining magnate, even Zara Nightfall's shadowy relatives, speaking through encrypted channels about their daughter's fate. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. These were the same families whose children had mocked humanity as violent and primitive. Now their sophisticated civilizations were helpless against an enemy that understood only force, while their own military forces proved inadequate to protect even the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution. On the 7th day of the siege, everything changed. Kara was monitoring the feeds during her lunch break when the transmission came through. It wasn't from any official Galactic Defense Force channel, instead, it originated from inside Nexus Academy itself. The image was grainy and, obviously recorded in secret, but she immediately recognized the setting: the Academy's Great Hall, now darkened and damaged by enemy fire. Professor Naleth appeared on screen, his 4 arms bound behind him as hegemony soldiers forced the Academy's faculty and students into organized groups. The elderly Thylorian's dignity remained intact despite his obvious fear. "This message is being broadcast at great risk," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The hegemony forces have made their intentions clear. They view this academy as a symbol of Galactic Council cooperation and integration. They plan to execute the students and faculty in order of their species' perceived threat level to their expansion. The camera panned across the gathered students, and Kara's heart clenched as she saw familiar faces. Marcus Vale stood protectively in front of smaller students, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine courage. Lydia Brass was helping tend to injured faculty members, her 3 eyes bright with unshed tears. Even Zara Nightfall had abandoned her shadow form, standing solid and visible in defiance of their captors. "The hegemony commander has indicated that humans will be executed last," Professor Naleth continued, "not out of mercy, but because they view humanity as the least significant threat to their expansion plans. They consider human civilization too primitive and violent to pose any real challenge to their advanced society." The transmission cut to static, but Kara had seen enough. The enemy's arrogance would be their downfall. They had dismissed humanity as insignificant, just as her former classmates had done. But, unlike those classmates, the hegemony would learn too late that human violence, when properly channeled, could be the galaxy's salvation rather than its shame. She stood abruptly, causing Rodriguez to look up from his meal. "I have to go." "Go where?" "Chen, your shift isn't over for another 4 hours." "I'm quitting." The words came out with surprising certainty. "I have to get to Axiom Prime." Rodriguez laughed harshly. "How exactly do you plan to do that?" "In case you haven't noticed, there's a full-scale war going on out there. The defense fleet can barely get supply ships through, let alone civilian transport." But Kara was already walking toward the plant's exit, her mind racing through possibilities. The Galactic Defense Force was too rigid, too dependent on conventional tactics that the enemy had already countered. What they needed wasn't more sophisticated strategy, they needed someone willing to think like a human, to embrace the controlled violence that other species found so disturbing. Her first stop was the local Defense Force recruiting station, a small office in downtown Detroit that had been overwhelmed with volunteers since the attacks began. Lieutenant Commander Park, a middle-aged Korean-American woman with tired eyes, looked up from a stack of paperwork as Kara entered. "Let me guess," Park said without preamble. "You want to enlist and go fight the big bad aliens. Do you have any military experience?" "No," Kara admitted. "But I have something better. I know Axiom Prime, and I know the enemy's blind spot." Park raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." "The hegemony dismisses humans as primitive and violent. They see our aggression as a weakness rather than recognizing it as an asset. Every other species in the galaxy tries to minimize casualties, to fight clean wars with minimal collateral damage. But humans learned warfare in the Detroit riots, the Amazon conflicts, the Siberian water wars. We know how to fight dirty when we have to." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps other species from trusting us," Park replied, but her tone suggested interest rather than dismissal. Then, maybe it's time to stop worrying about what other species think and start worrying about winning this war. Kira leaned across the desk. Those students at Nexus Academy are going to die unless someone gets them out. The defense fleet can't break through because they're fighting the enemy's kind of war. But what if someone fought humanity's kind of war instead? Park studied her for a long moment. You're talking about a suicide mission. The Academy is surrounded by forces that have defeated some of the galaxy's best military units. Even if you could somehow get planetside, you'd be one person against an army. Sometimes one person is enough. Kira's voice carried a conviction that surprised even her. I spent months on Axiom Prime learning the city's hidden passages, its forgotten tunnels and abandoned sectors. I know how to move without being detected, how to strike without warning. And I know something the enemy doesn't: humans don't just fight to win. We fight to protect what matters. 2 days later, Kira found herself aboard the transport ship Relentless, bound for the outer edges of the Nexus system. Her official status was Special Operations Consultant, a designation that gave her access to military resources without requiring her to follow standard protocols. The ship's captain, a grizzled veteran named Torres who had fought in the Centauri border conflicts, was skeptical but willing to trust Admiral Martinez's judgment. You sure about this, Chen? Torres asked as they approached Axiom Prime's orbital space. Once we drop you off, we can't stick around to provide support. The hegemony's got this whole system locked down tighter than a vacuum seal. Through the viewport, Kira could see the planet that had once represented her greatest failure. Smoke rose from burning cities, and alien warships patrolled the atmosphere like predators circling wounded prey. Somewhere down there, her former classmates waited for death while their advanced civilizations proved helpless to save them. I'm sure, she said, checking her equipment one final time. The gear was a mixture of human military surplus and improvised tools, nothing sophisticated enough to trigger the hegemony's sensor networks, but effective enough to level the playing field when used properly. Remember, your primary objective is intelligence gathering, Torres continued. Command needs to know the enemy's capabilities and weaknesses. Rescuing the Academy students is secondary. Kira met his eyes steadily. Understood, sir. But they both knew she was lying. The moment she set foot on Axiom Prime, her only priority would be reaching those students, regardless of military protocol or strategic objectives. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten her expelled from the Academy in the first place, but now, it might be the only thing that could save the people who had once judged her for it. The insertion pod hurtled through Axiom Prime's atmosphere like a falling star, its heat shields glowing against the darkness. As Kira prepared for landing, she thought about Professor Naletha's words during their last class together, his lecture about the Thylorian philosophy of contained aggression, about channeling violent impulses into constructive pursuits. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps there were times when violence, properly applied, was the most constructive force of all. The hegemony had dismissed humanity as too primitive to pose a threat, just as her classmates had dismissed her as too violent to belong among civilized species. Both would learn the truth before this was over. Sometimes, civilization needed barbarians to protect it from the real monsters lurking in the dark.